guys, it's Cece, and welcome to a series of unfortunate discussions. Today I'm going to be talking about a series of unfortunate events, as is clear by the name of the video. Discussion, clearly. So today I'm going to be talking about The Reptile Room, which is book 3 in a series of unfortunate events by Lemony Snicket, and I will also be talking about episodes 5 and 6 of the Netflix series, which is The Wide Window parts 1 and 2. If you guys are here, I assume you've seen my other 2 videos. If you haven't, maybe go watch those. I'm probably going to reference them a couple times, but beyond that, let's just jump in, and we're going to start by talking about the book. So The Wide Window is the longest of all 4 books that I did for this reread. It is the longest of the 4 books that they're covering for this Netflix series, which I think is just an important thing to mention. It's about 30 or so pages longer than all the rest, and I think it shows. I think that there's a bit more fleshing out of characters in this one. I think you get to know Aunt Josephine a little bit better, and I just think it gives the story in general a little bit more to latch onto, so I appreciate that this one is a bit longer. However, this is also the point at which I feel that the series in general starts to get a bit repetitive. For a lot of books, you kind of get the same or similar stories over and over again, and I think you really start to notice it in this 3rd book when, basically the same stuff is happening that's happened in the last 2, especially the same as what happened in the Reptile Room. And just like when I was about 9 years old, I am still frustrated by the Baudelaires and will always be frustrated by the fact that they insist on telling Olaf their plan to defeat him every time so that he can just stop them. I know that they're children and so I can't judge them that hard, but even when I was 9, I was like, what would really help the Baudelaires out? They should probably stop telling Count Olaf their plan beforehand. And it's been over a decade, and I stand by 9-year-old me's opinion of how the Baudelaires function. I really like Josephine as a guardian in this book, not because she's a very good guardian, but I think that she's a really interesting character. I appreciate that the Baudelaires in this book get the chance to look at someone who has been destroyed by grief. It's just interesting because we spend a lot of time talking about how the children respond to their parents' death, and while they're really sad and they go through all these things, it doesn't destroy them. In fact, it brings them together, and overall throughout the series, I think makes them stronger, and I think that it's just a cool way to play off of the children by showing them what it looks like when grief does destroy, because it can. I also think that it's good for them to see that kind of person because I think it's an important step in the Baudelaire's journey into recognizing that they can't just shut down and be afraid, and I think that that's something that they drag forward throughout the rest of the series. So I appreciate Josephine for that thing that she offers the children and that I think is a lesson that they take forward in their lives. My problem with Josephine has always been that I'm frustrated by the way that her story ends, and actually I really like the change that the show did with Josephine, which I will talk a little bit more about in a minute. The last thing I want to talk about in regards to the book is the fact that I really love and continue to love in each book the development of the Baudelaires as characters. In this book, I think you start to see them get a lot more resilient, a lot more self-reliant, and some of it you see them get a bit more angry. This applies to Violet in particular, I believe. But as far as resilience, I mean, they do some pretty daring things in this book, which again is something I believe is because they're playing off of Josephine and her fears, but they give themselves severe allergic reactions in order to get out of a scenario, or they go out on a lake during a storm. These are things that are completely not safe, and I think that they are willing to do those things because the situation has gotten more and more dire and they've learned that they're just going to have to rely on themselves. So I just think that that's interesting as we continue to see the children develop. This happens more and more and more, but I think it's relevant in this story in particular because they're learning those things from Josephine and the way that her fear has trapped her, and I think that it's teaching them a lot to not think about fear and to face fear head on. So really, really appreciated that. Those are in general my thoughts about The Wide Window. I like The Reptile Room a little bit more than The Wide Window because I really like Monty, but still a pretty solid book in the series. So yeah, enjoyed. Okay, so those are all of my feelings about the book, and now I want to talk about episodes 5 and 6, and I thought that I would start by just jumping in and telling you a few really quick thoughts that aren't really discussion-y, they're just like quick sentence-long opinions. Once again, I really like the new intro. The intro continues to grow on me, and I get excited when I start a new episode now to hear the new intro. There isn't one every new episode, it's every, 2-parter, and I get excited to hear the new verse and sort of the silly things that they do with that. I loved that the island was shaped like an eye. Huge fan. In this episode, Sunny wore the world's best hat, and she was adorable. Klaus, once again, bringing it with some of my favorite lines by smashing gender expectations, and he had that little nod where he was like, some boys like to play with dolls. I was like, yeah, Klaus, you tell him. You continue to have those statements about gender that make me go, yeah! I don't have as much to add about this, but I just have to say, what was this Lemony Snicket outfit? Because, I guess I'm a fan, but it was alarming. Oh, and bravo on the lachrymose leeches. Those were very, very scary, and I think the show did a great job of capturing how completely terrifying they were. Until the very last minute, but we will get to that when I talk about Josephine, which I guess let's just do that now. So Aunt Josephine was played by Alfre Woodard, and I've seen her in a few other things, so it was really fun to see her jump into this role and really embrace it. I think that overall she did a pretty great job. Even stuff like her super dramatic screams where she would see herself in the mirror or someone would slam something, I think that they were done in enough moderation that they didn't seem too over the top for me, and I thought that it was just a great extension of that character to see her just living on screen. I thought that she did a great job of bringing Aunt Josephine to life and making her seem both realistic, but also just a bit over the top that you get with this show and with the series in general. I think that they nailed her constant attention to grammar without also making it overwhelming. There are certain things that they repeat a little too often, like the kids telling people, we know what that word means. Like, it was fun the first couple of times, but at this point, I'm super over it. So I think that they did the grammar corrections in enough moderation that it made sense later when the Baudelaires were looking at the note, but not so much that you're like, I get it, Aunt Josephine cares about grammar. And the main thing that I want to talk about Aunt Josephine that I loved was the change at the very end, and this isn't acting as much as writing. I loved that we got to see fierce and formidable Aunt Josephine right at the end. As I was saying in the book, one of my frustrations is that ending that she has, and I think in the books, the children don't get to see the fact that Aunt Josephine was a fierce and formidable person at one point. And I just think it was a really valid piece of information for them to have going forward as characters, that yes, grief did destroy Aunt Josephine momentarily, but at the end, she spent her last moments standing up for herself and standing up to Count Olaf in particular, which is not something that the Baudelaires have seen. When it comes to adults in the series, overall, I think we can agree that the Baudelaires have been fairly let down, and even when people stand up for them, they don't necessarily stand up to Olaf as a character, and I appreciate that Aunt Josephine was like, Olaf, I am mad at you, here are the reasons I'm standing up for myself, and I'm showing the Baudelaires that there are adults out there who will stand up for them and will stand up against Count Olaf. I just thought that was a great, great moment for her. No, I think that the kids just needed that moment of seeing another adult in their life telling Olaf to shove it. I think that that was probably therapeutic for them for like a minute, and then obviously things went very, very wrong. And then the leeches, where I was talking about how they were really scary and then they weren't at all. So Aunt Josephine gets pushed overboard and she gets eaten alive by leeches. She dies in front of them, being eaten alive. And over the top, the show decided to play silly music again, and I just don't understand those music choices. The series is called A Series of Unfortunate Events, and I just wish that at any point with any given character or moment, the show was allowed to be unfortunate, was allowed to be perceived as really scary or not bad. I don't want to scare the children, but I just want the seriousness of certain situations to come through in the show, and I just don't think that the show is allowing for that to happen. So I want to talk about Olaf. Yes, I know I said in my last discussion I wasn't going to mention him again, but the reason I'm bringing him up is actually a pretty positive reason, so you get a little bit of Olaf talk. I actually really appreciated his disguise in these 2 episodes as Captain Sham. I loved his oversized, fake teeth that I think he had in. I think that that's what was pushing his jaw so far forward. I just thought that he really lived that disguise more than the other ones, and I thought it came across as fairly authentic, which I really appreciated. And actually I liked his portrayal of Captain Sham so much that I didn't even mind the fact that he sang a sea shanty, which is impressive because overall we know that I've been very negative about singing in the show, especially when Count Olaf does it. And by the way, when I say sea shanty, I mean large lake shanty, as we are constantly told. So let's talk about the kids now, and I want to talk about Melina Weissman as Violet because she really, really impressed me in the last episode of The Wide Window. At the very end of that episode, she got so furious and bitter, and she was just obviously enraged at Mr. Poe, and I really appreciated that because I love Violet and I love her rage as she goes forward, so she did a great job of capturing that. Also, this isn't character development in any way, but her high-waisted pants, when she showed back up after her baking soda bath and she was wearing those high-waisted pants, I was so about those. Those are fabulous. It was a nice change from dresses for Violet, but also just like, I just loved them as like a costuming choice. Solid. I love high-waisted pants, so. And as far as Lewis Hines goes, I just have to mention one of the best moments of both episodes, in which he had a line that had such perfect comedic timing. It was hysterical. And it was near the end of the second episode when Josephine is going on her rant and she says something along the lines of, I don't care, you could push my house off the edge of a cliff. And there's just this huge pause where Klaus kind of looks over at Violet and then eventually goes, later. And it was so funny. I love when kids can really hit that comedic timing well, and I think when it comes to child actors, you kind of have it or you don't, and clearly he does. Let's talk about VFD and Lemony Snicket. So VFD is what I'm going to use to talk about the Secret Society. Feels repetitive to constantly say the Secret Society. VFD. But first, I want to mention Lemony Snicket. He had some great moments in this episode. I loved his weather reporting. I thought that was really fun. It was both lighthearted and dark at the same time, which I think kind of encapsulates Lemony Snicket as a narrator, so I loved it. Like I said, I loved that bizarre bright orange jacket outfit that he wore. I don't know what purpose it served, but it was just a joy to see. Also, we got a little bit more info about VFD, which thrills me every time it happens. We got the implication that Snicket is a name that we should know in regards to the Secret Society. When Larry, the guy from The Anxious Clown, is fighting with Olaf, there is this little nod that the most valuable member of VFD is Snicket, and then I think Olaf is the one who says, isn't he dead? And I was like, as you know, I'm a huge fan of the Secret Society stuff being thrown in so early, so it's really fun for me to see hints and mentions of some of that stuff that you don't get for so much longer, because it's just really exciting. So I loved that exchange. I also liked Larry in general. He was a great little, again, inclusion of a side plot that's to do with VFD, and I think that stuff was toned down more in these two episodes than it was in the reptile room, so it didn't overwhelm the Baudelaire storyline. So I appreciated that, and I appreciated him as a character a little bit more than I liked Jacqueline in the last couple episodes. Also, I have to talk about this because I noticed it immediately, and I want to make sure everyone else did, just in case you didn't notice, but Daniel Handler had a cameo in this episode. So Daniel Handler is, of course, the real-life Lemony Snicket. Lemony Snicket is a pen name for Daniel Handler, so he's the one who wrote the books, and he actually gets a cameo right after a VFD moment. So when Josephine is walking through the market, then someone says they are selling very fresh dill, and I was like, oh, a VFD, and then it moves on to the guy selling fish, and it was Daniel Handler, and I was like, that's such a great way to include him. First of all, to include him in a cameo is a good idea, but also to include him immediately after a VFD reference, pitch perfect. Loved it. I really like that the show is connecting the different caretakers. I think that it makes a lot more sense than it does in the books, where it just feels like the children are being dropped off at one place after another, and you're like, where is this list of people that they were supposed to live with after their parents died, and what a weird collection of people. I like that the show is giving the implication that every single one of the caretakers knows one another. How they know one another is still sort of kind of mysterious, kind of not, but I like that there's some sort of connection, so it doesn't just feel like, here's another random person to take care of you for a couple days. So apparently we got a little mention that Monty knew Aunt Josephine. Obviously, Olaf has said that he knows both Monty and Josephine as well. Olaf is the one who mentions it in the reptile room when he says he's the one who took the picture of Monty and the Baudelaire parents in the piano, and then this episode, Josephine mentions it, where Klaus is talking about children who used to burn ants through a magnifying glass, and Josephine says, oh, Olaf used to do that. And then at the end, Olaf also spends a long time talking about the things that they used to do together, that apparently Josephine and Olaf used to know each other pretty well, and that was really great. Anyway, I got a little off track there. I got excited talking about how Olaf is interwound through stuff, but then I like that we are getting connections as to why the Lucky Smells lumber mill of all places, because in the books it's kind of weird that children go to a lumber mill because they are just dropped off there and that's it. You're like, okay, I guess the children are at the Lucky Smells lumber mill now. But I like that in the show they've changed it so it's the kids running away to that location and they know why they are going to a lumber mill. It just makes it make a lot more sense. Plus it's really in character because I think in the books the kids do eventually run off again a little bit later. So it's really in character for me to see them run off on their own to get more answers. Also, one other thing to do with Lemony Snicket, Beatrice was written in the foundation of Aunt Josephine's house, and I was like, what? What does that mean? I realized recently when I was reading the comments from my last video that I haven't talked about the theater troupe yet, Olaf's theater troupe, so I guess I can give them a quick mention. Overall, I'm kind of meh on them. I think that the two women with the powdered faces are my favorite of the bunch. I think that they do a good job of being both creepy and silly. I don't really like the hook-handed man, because in the books he's like completely terrifying and they've made him sort of a bumbling idiot in the show, and so sometimes I like him, but sometimes he's just not my favorite. And then the other ones in the troupe, I don't really have an opinion about one way or another. Sometimes I think they have good lines, but overall they just sort of fade into the background for me. My favorite thing about them in these two episodes, though, was the scene where they are trying to subconsciously make Aunt Josephine think about Captain Sham as a person, and so as she's walking through the market, they're all just sort of shouting Captain Sham back and forth at one another and talking about what a great guy he is. That's been my favorite thing so far that the theater troupe has done. So those are my thoughts on the theater troupe. Some other thoughts. I thought that the scene in the library at the very end was a bit too much, where the house is falling off the edge and all the kids are like upside down, and Klaus at one point like does a backflip out of the house and then a front flip back inside. That was going a bit too much for me. Overall, I really liked the setting of these episodes. I liked the look of the area, how that all just looked on screen, how it looked compared to Aunt Josephine's house, to the town below, and in general, I just thought the set for these two episodes was designed really well. And I just have to talk about the fact that that photo that Klaus found was so Order of the Phoenix, like, whoo! He pulled out that picture and I was like, wow, we are going hardcore Order of the Phoenix on this one. And even the picture was a bit like Lily James, Frank Alice kind of thing. I just really appreciated that. Alright, who would I be at this point if I don't talk about color? I feel like at this point you all must be watching for the color, right? It's not still just me who cares about the color? So I really liked the color design elements of this episode, even though I was a bit wrong on some of my predictions. The children in this episode wore much dimmer clothing. I was expecting them to look pretty bright, but they had actually toned down the saturation a lot, which I do think makes sense from a design standpoint. I think that they are starting to lose faith a little bit, and so that element of them looking dimmer and darker does work. They looked like they fit into this super dim, dark setting, and, you know, this is a dim, dark setting. It isn't a safe space for them. Aunt Josephine doesn't make them feel particularly welcome or like this is a place where they belong. So all of that really low saturation stuff worked for me. Initially, I was a bit confused as to why the taxi was so bright, and this is really just me theorizing more than anything else, but I think that the taxi is also just sort of throughout the episode, whenever they need transportation, he shows up, and I think that maybe the bright color was just a reflection on how valuable that was for them to have someone who is always going to show up for them. That might be stretching it, but I was like, why is that taxi so darn yellow? And that's my theory. And I also really like all of the color design elements at the end. Once the children realize that Aunt Josephine is alive, their costumes shoot up in terms of saturation. They go from wearing dimmer clothing to wearing the brightest primary colored clothes they have worn thus far. I think that's a real reflection of how hopeful they are for the future. They know Aunt Josephine is alive. There's still a chance that they're going to get out of Count Olaf's clutches, and I think that their clothing is a reflection of that. And I also like at the very end when they're on the truck heading to the Lucky Smells lumber mill, they look up above them and the sky is super, super bright with those birds pointing in the right direction, because again, I think that they're moving towards something hopeful. They hope that there are going to be answers there. There's a chance that they're going to learn something, and so I appreciated those color things as well. I like talking about color with this show. I think that the next episode is going to be one of the dimmest and darkest. I don't think that we're going to see a ton of super saturated scenes, so yeah. that's my color talk as usual for these. Anyway, what did you think of these two episodes? Did you like the adaptation? How did you feel about Aunt Josephine, about Captain Sham, about the kids and Mr. Poe? What were your feelings on all of that? In general, just leave your thoughts about all of those things down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye!